Welcome to the Border Chronicle audio podcast. This is our first dispatch of 2022. So, a very happy new year to you all. It is also amazing that it's been a full year since the Joe Biden administration took office. And that is exactly what we'll be contemplating today. From a broad border perspective, but also honing in more specifically on the immigration detention system. So, luckily, I have a leading expert, César Cuauhtémoc García Hernández, who will be joining me for the next half an hour. César is an author, a lawyer, an immigration scholar, a law professor at Ohio State University, and he brings all kinds of insight and expertise to this topic. He was born and raised in McAllen, Texas, right in the southern Texas borderlands, and his most recent book is titled "Migrating to Prison: America's Obsession with Locking Up Immigrants." So, with that lens, we analyze and assess, or Cesar analyzes and assesses the past year of the Biden administration, but at the same time, and just as important, or I would even say more importantly, he looks at what we should be looking at in 2022. Like, what are the different things, dynamics, patterns that we should be looking at in this year, especially as we approach the midterm elections? Thank you for joining us today. This interview for me was very informative and insightful. Well, thank you very much, Cesar, for joining me. I mean, I really want to hear your assessment of the first year. Here we are in January. We're at 1 year of the Biden administration. And I really do want to hear your assessment of that first year, especially in terms of immigrant detention. But first, I just wanted to start out with a broader, more contextual question. I mean, first of all, what was their campaign promises from the Biden administration about what he was going to change in terms of immigrant detention? What exactly would he be changing? Is it just changes coming from what was done in the Trump administration, or are the changes more profound and come from a deeper history? So I was wondering if you could just start us off by talking about that bigger, broader context.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for starting off by thinking more broadly, not just about what's happening right now in January 2022, but what was the promise that the Biden-Harris campaign made to the public, and how is that similar or different from where we are today? And yeah, I'll say when it came to the campaign's immigration platform, they heavily emphasize a shift in tenor, a shift in rhetoric, a shift in the tone with which both individual officials within the administration were to talk about immigration and immigrants, and of course a change in policy as well. And when it comes to the change in tenor and change in tone and rhetoric, of course we've seen that from the president on down. The way in which people talk in the Biden and Harris administration talk about immigrants is radically different from the way that we got accustomed to hearing from the Trump administration. And I think that is a very welcome and it is a meaningful shift. Words matter. And as a result, I think the way in which we talk about immigration and immigrants themselves is hugely important. But when it comes to immigration detention policy, the administration, or rather the campaign, was fairly narrow in its promises, I think, in that, yeah, they never really promised to pull back in any dramatic manner from using detention as a core component of the incoming administration's immigration enforcement tactics, and we've seen exactly that. The one promise area, or the one area in which the administration, or rather the campaign, did promise a very specific and meaningful change was to end the use of for-profit detention. Depending on which statements you look at, maybe that was broadly ending for-profit immigration detention generally, or maybe in some statements seem to indicate that they were just thinking about asylum seekers, not putting asylum seekers in for-profit immigration prisons. Regardless of which of those, the narrow or the broad version of those promises we look at, what we see a year out is that has not happened, and there's really no movement in that direction. We have seen the administration push the Justice Department to start to end its relationship with private prison companies in the standard federal criminal imprisonment context, but we have not seen a similar move in the immigration context directed by the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency. So we're still waiting to see whether or not that promise is something that the administration is going to try to make real.
Is there pressure on the administration to fulfill that particular promise around private immigration detention?
Yeah, certainly the advocacy community has not forgotten, and it's one of a growing list of sources of frustration. Certainly from big picture comprehensive immigration reform that has completely run into the congressional roadblocks, to very more narrow, more defined, clearly defined proposals like ending the use of for-profit detention centers in the immigration context. I mean, we've seen very little on the from the administration in making those real, and so activists activists don't have short memories, and at this point it's one we are seeing the activist community that was quite instrumental in pushing back against the Trump administration and helping to push the Biden-Harris campaign into the White House is growing frustrated.
Yeah. And how about in other, when you're looking at the last year, is there any other, has there been less deportations? Has there been less people put in detention? Is there any other figures that you can point to that you've seen any changes, or has there been no change, or could you speak to that?
Yeah, when it comes to immigration, the detention population, specifically that is being housed by the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, what we're seeing is that the population numbers that the agency was holding at the end of the Trump administration and the beginning of the Biden administration, to January of 2021. Was at a historical low. I mean, we had not seen figures that low since at all this century, meaning since the existence of the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency as an entity, and slowly the numbers started to go up under the Biden administration. They are down from that point right now in January of 2022, but they're still above where they were when the Biden administration inherited the reins of the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency. So what we're seeing is that the Biden administration is very much following the pattern set by the Obama administration. Now, the Obama administration famously presided over the largest immigration detention population in the history of the United States prior to the Trump administration. So we had one record surpassed by another record. We are not yet seeing under the Biden administration a return to those record-setting practices under Obama, and certainly not under Trump. But we are seeing that immigration detention is taking its place as a centerpiece of the way in which the Biden administration approaches immigration policy. And I suppose I should say that is not at all a surprise, because on the campaign trail, the neither then Vice President Biden nor then Senator Harris ever really promised a departure from that. Yes, they promised to depart from the worst aspects of the Trump administration, and there were many, right, to focus on. And so I think that was sort of, in a way, it was kind of an out, right? It was a way for them to meaningfully distinguish themselves from the Trump administration, but without having to tackle the hard questions of how they were going to distinguish themselves from the Obama administration. And what we're seeing is, I think, a return to the prior Democratic administration, which of course should be no surprise, given that now President Biden was Vice President Biden at that time.
I imagine what you're saying would be, or is going to come as a surprise to some people. And it makes me think about, when you think about the longer history and how when you're discussing the Biden administration, we're often thinking, just comparing it to Trump, but you're saying, well, let's look back to Obama. So I have a couple questions in terms of the buildup of the immigrant detention system that we have now, and the bipartisan nature of it. Could you speak to that, over the longer period of the last couple decades, or since the inception of ICE? And also, I'd also be curious to know, with your expertise, what kind of misconceptions in the general public do you often come upon when you're looking at immigration detention?
Right. So when Migrating to Prison, my book Migrating to Prison came out, it was December 2019. So we were fully in the middle of the Trump administration, and so when I would talk to people about it, most people would assume that I wrote it in response to the Trump administration. And I would say, no, maybe it's just because I'm a slow writer, but maybe it's just the publication process. But it takes a long time to write and then, actually release a book. I actually started writing the book, and certainly I came up with the idea and I pitched the idea during the Obama administration. And I did that because what I was seeing was that the population numbers were growing, right? Conditions were really bad, and it was really difficult to get people to wrap their minds around the fact that this could be happening under a Democratic administration, under a fairly liberal Democratic administration, right? And a sort of a historical administration like that of President Obama. And so, yeah, I think it is absolutely critical to think about the historical perspective and to think about the bipartisan enthusiasm that we've seen going back to the 1980s, in which Republicans and Democrats, whether it was under Reagan or whether it was under Bush or Clinton or moving forward, right, into the present day, we've always seen a willingness by the presidents, whoever that is, and members of Congress to support an expanding immigration detention population, going back at least now for 4 decades. Congress has been willing to fund it. The presidential administrations have been willing to operate it. Yes, the Republicans and Democrats will sometimes disagree on just how broadly, exactly who, how many people, what exactly should be the willingness of the administration to make access to counsel a little bit easier or a little bit harder, right? So on the edges, there are some distinctions, and for some people, those are meaningful distinctions. But at the core, Republican and Democratic administrations, Republicans and Democrats in Congress have supported legislation going back to the 80s, like the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 and the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1988 and the Immigration Act of 1990, and in the late 90s, the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act of 96, and so on and so on and so on, and policies that one administration enacts and another one reiterates or changes and slightly. We're not in a situation in which the Trump administration inaugurated a policy from scratch. Yes, they weaponized things. They made things worse, right? They took things to extremes that in some instances were difficult to imagine in the past. They did not inaugurate wholly new policies out of thin air, and the Biden administration is very much returning to that more standard practice without the flares of the Trump administration, either in rhetoric or in policy, but very much still resulting in an immigrant detention population that on an average basis, on an average day, is still hovering around 20,000 people who are in ICE's custody every single day.
Yeah, I'm curious about that. Do you think that because you talked initially about the rhetorical shifts, right? With the incoming Biden Harris administration and how they're welcome, right? They're the how talking about enforcement and detention is not like the during the Trump administration we got used to just like Trump saying whatever he wanted and coming off very I mean just even racist, right? And so you have that shift. But the thing that I'm thinking about that shift is with that shift, a rhetorical shift, but when you continue the same policy and you still have as many people in like incarcerated or in detention, does that does that mask what's going on? Does that sort of put a like a happy face but on the same thing? Or what is your take on that?
Yeah, and so let me be clear. Look, the Trump administration, at its high water mark, there were over 50,000 people who ICE was detaining on a given day. Right now, or at the end of December, rather, so mid December, there were shy of 22,000 people. So that's a meaningful difference, to be sure. So I don't wanna to pretend that that's not meaningful. I think your point is well taken, that even if we're not looking at the high water mark of the Trump administration, over the course of the 4 years, the pattern was very similar to what we're seeing now, and that detention is really an important part of the administration's immigration policy framework, and to the extent that the rhetoric has shifted dramatically, and it has, in a way that I think is positive, does that sort of mean that it's easy to ignore the reality that there are still almost 22,000 people, right, who are locked up, who are separated from families, who can't go to work, who in many instances can't access lawyers or social workers who might help them navigate what is a high stakes immigration legal process, with extremely meaningful consequences that result from that? I think I think the rhetoric can mask that, because it means that there isn't always a soundbite that gets our attention. And President Trump famously did that quite well. He was great at saying things that were almost impossible to ignore, even if you wanted to, not only because of the fact that he was the president of the United States, but also because of the way that he said that, right? So denigrating human beings, right, in the acerbic, racist, misogynistic way that he was famous for lots of people in the United States. We know that was attractive. That is attractive. For many others, that was repulsive. And whether it was repulsive or whether it was attractive, it was always eye catching, right? And he is great at doing that, in the way that salesmen are great at doing that. But I think for us now living under the Biden Harris administration, I think it's important to be cognizant of the fact that even if the president and the vice president aren't giving us this sort of impossible to ignore the soundbite, we do need to be thinking hard about what exactly the administration is doing. How is it treating other human beings? What is it doing on our behalf? And there, I think we do see a lot of similarities. There are still the same companies that are making lots of money off of locking up immigrants. There are still asylum seekers. There are still people with green cards who are being held in immigration prisons throughout the United States. They're still having trouble getting lawyers. They're still having trouble seeing social workers. It's still hard for journalists to get into these facilities and figure out what's happening. And so I think in terms of the practice of immigration detention, we're seeing that the Immigration and Customs Enforcement agencies infrastructure that was built under President Obama, that was highly charged under President Trump, remains in place under President Biden.
Yeah, that brings me to the question about 2022. As we enter this new year, what do you think we're going to see from the Biden-Harris administration this year? What should people be looking for? What should activists be looking at?
I think we should be seeing whether the Biden administration cowers to the right in fear of the November elections, the midterm elections. I think we should be concerned that they're going to try to follow the Obama administration playbook of trying to woo Republican voters, and my worry is that we will see that, and my worry is that the way that we'll see that play out is by hardening the line when it comes to immigration policy, because they're going to get attacked on that. They're going to get attacked from the Ted Cruz's and the Josh Hawleys. I mean, they're going to get attacked from the Lauren Boeberts of the world. In the members of Congress, the House in particular, that are facing tough elections. I think the Democratic Party is facing a sort of a crossroads. Are they going to take a position that stands strongly in defense of immigrants, or are they going to do what is sort of practiced for many Democrats, which is cower in the face of what are unrelenting attacks on immigrants from all the way from former President Trump, who be endorsing and campaigning on behalf of candidates, to those candidates themselves. And so that's what I'm looking for in terms of the politics of immigration. And in terms of the policies, I think I'm looking to see how exactly are the numbers gonna be shaping out. Will the immigration detention population start heading back upwards as the campaigns start heating up? Is that going to result in more people being locked up? Are we going to see the administration actually try to turn that campaign promise of curtailing for-profit detention into reality, or are they just going to sort of throw up their hands and say we have better things to do with our time, or that wasn't the real promise, that was just words that we put up on our website. So far we haven't seen much action on that, and I'm curious to know whether that'll remain true. And then we see in the courts, and we see the administration continuing to defend vigorously policies and practices that are from the Trump administration days, and I think that's one of those areas where there's no reason why parties, including the federal government, regularly go back on switch tactics in the middle of litigation. And we've seen that we see that regularly when one president leaves office and another comes in, and we've seen that under the Biden administration, and but we haven't seen it in the immigration context. And so we're seeing sort of what is standard practice in the immigration context, which is doesn't really matter who's the president. They're all fairly consistently supportive of hardline stances on immigration policies, expanding ICE's ability to detain more people and limiting the court's ability to second guess that. And we're seeing that already, and I'd be curious to see exactly how that plays out in the coming months.
Do you see any room for hope at all, or any sort of ways that things can improve?
Yeah, I do. Look, I think the Biden administration is so there's two parts to it. There's the folks who we all think of, right? The elected officials like the president, the vice president, and the cabinet secretaries that who appear on TV and in newspapers on a regular basis. And then there's all the lower level folks who have a meaningful amount of power within a particular agency, within a particular unit, and I think a lot of those people are actually good people who are trying to turn the enormous bureaucracy that is the federal government, that is the Department of Homeland Security and the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency in particular. And that takes time, that takes effort, and that takes a lot of people. And I think a lot of those folks are there. I think they need political cover, right? They need the administration from the White House down to the political appointees at the departments, at DHS and ICE, to give them the room to make the changes that some of these folks, some of whom I've known for many years, are really smart people, good-hearted people who want to do that, but they need the political cover because immigration is nothing if not a highly politicized area of law and policy. And so I think for folks on the outside, right, for people who are engaged with what's going on in our country, I think continuing to pressure elected officials, continuing to pressure the administration, to at least give these folks the room that they need to do the work that I think they know how to do. I think a lot of them want to be able to do that. For me is where there's an enormous amount of hope. And at the local level, I think there are lots of under the Trump administration activists really focused on city councils, county commissions, state legislatures, and I think that focus has not shifted at all. And I'm hopeful that we'll continue to see some really progressive changes and new policies get enacted at the state and local level. And that's completely separate from whatever's happening in Washington.
Yeah, and one last question. In your book, Migrating to Prison, at the end of the book, you advocate for the abolition of the immigrant detention system. And maybe that would be an interesting place to end, just to hear what your thoughts on that, what you mean by that, and why you think that would be a good idea.
Yeah, when I say that we should abolish immigration prisons, I think that means that we should just abolish immigration prisons. We should not have them. We should close them down. The sooner the better. And we should turn that spending all of those billions of dollars toward actually helping people who are trying to navigate what is always a sort of a precarious existence in the United States. Even for those of us who have the good fortune of U.S. citizenship and stable employment, living in the United States is never easy. And as a result, I think, we should repurpose the billions of dollars, quite literally billions of dollars, that ICE gets every year to operate its detention system, to providing social workers and lawyers and case managers for folks who are navigating treacherous waters that are immigration law and policy. Of course, I don't see that happening in the current political environment, but that's okay. Major shifts in politics don't happen from one day to the next. So we didn't end up with the immigration detention population and prison system that we have today from one day to the next. We're not going to unravel it from one day to the next, but I think we have to keep our eyes on the focus on the fact that there are people who are being locked up with the justification is, they'll endanger the community, or they won't show up. And, the reality is, we know that's not true. We know that most people show up for court dates. We know that most people are not out endangering the community. And we know that we have a really biased legal process in which there are lots of people out there who are endangering the community, who get away with it, who are not policed, who are not prosecuted, prosecuted, who are not imprisoned. And I think that is it is extremely troubling to throw migrants behind barbed wire simply because they dared to move from one place to another on the face of the earth, doing what people have been doing for millennia, but they happen to do so across borders and without the federal government's permission.
Thank you so much, Cesar. This is very informative and insightful. I really appreciate it. Where can people reach you or see your work?
So the best place to get a hold of me is at my website, crimmigration.com, CRIMMIGRATION.com. And you can get access to my books and my articles and learn more about me through there.
Thank you so much.
All right, take care.